People often picture the Middle Ages as a time filled with noble knights, grand castles, and stories of honor and romance. But the truth was much darker and far more unforgiving than those legends make it seem. Back then, the average person was lucky to live anywhere between 30 and 40 years, and countless children never even made it to adulthood. If you managed to survive those early years, you still faced constant danger every single day, with threats that no prayer, lucky charm, or folk remedy could truly protect you from. Death was always close, waiting in ways most people couldn't predict. So, let's step back into that harsh world together and explore some of the grim and unsettling ways people in the medieval era lost their lives. War, during the Middle Ages, it seemed like every kingdom was fighting someone. No matter where you looked, there was another invasion, another siege, or another war breaking out. The Vikings, the Norman conquest, and the Mongol invasions all left their mark on history. Major conflicts like the Crusades, the Wars of the Roses, and the 100 Years' War shaped the medieval world. Ironically, despite its name, the 100 Years' War actually lasted around 116 years. The shorter title just happened to sound better. That long and bitter struggle kept the kings of England and France locked in conflict for generations. One of the darkest chapters of the 100 Years' War came in the early 15th century when Paris found itself under siege. An anonymous writer known as the Bourgeois de Paris recorded the terrible events that unfolded in the city between 1405 and 1449. Historians believe he may have been a priest connected to the University of Paris. His writings show that he closely followed not only what was happening in the capital, but also the growing chaos spreading across France. At the same time, the country was being torn apart by a civil war between the Armagnac faction of the House of Orléans and the House of Burgundy. Their bitter rivalry repeatedly spilled into the streets of Paris, turning neighborhoods into battlefields. One of the bloodiest moments came during the Armagnac massacre of 1418, when somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people were killed. The chronicler described the horrifying violence in heartbreaking detail. Everyone they found, no matter who they were or what rank they held, whether they had already been taken prisoner or not, was dragged into the streets and slaughtered without mercy using heavy axes and other weapons. Nearly every man carried some kind of weapon, and as they passed the bodies lying in the streets, they struck them again even after they were already dead. Women, children, and even those too weak to fight cursed the victims, calling them filthy traitors and saying they had received better than they deserved. Not a single major street in Paris escaped the bloodshed. Before anyone could walk 100 yards, the dead had already been stripped until nothing remained but their trousers. Their bodies were piled together in the mud like slabs of bacon. It was a horrifying sight. That day alone, 522 men were killed in the streets of Paris by swords and other weapons, not including those murdered inside homes. As horrifying as the massacre was, the people of Paris believed they had one small mercy to be grateful for. The chronicler wrote, "That night such heavy rain fell that there was no foul smell. The rain washed their wounds so completely that by morning nothing remained but dried blood, with none of the usual decay." Even though cities often offered better protection than the open countryside during wartime, everyday life was still filled with fear and hardship. Food supplies quickly ran out, starvation became common, and simply being caught in the path of a marching army could mean the complete destruction of an entire village. Innocent people were rarely spared, and civilians frequently suffered just as much as the soldiers. One of the most common military tactics during the 100 Years' War was the chevauchée, a fast-moving raid designed to terrorize the enemy. Soldiers would loot homes, burn crops, destroy villages, and wipe out valuable resources to weaken both morale and the economy. Although these raids became especially common during the late Middle Ages, the strategy itself was far older. William the Conqueror had already used similar tactics during his campaign following the Norman invasion of 1066. Life wasn't any easier for the men fighting on the battlefield. Every battle carried the constant risk of a gruesome death. Swords, axes, spears, and arrows caused devastating injuries that medieval medicine could do little to treat. Doctors often relied on red-hot irons or crude cauterization to stop bleeding, while badly damaged limbs were amputated without any form of anesthesia. Whether a wounded soldier survived usually came down to pure luck. Infection was almost expected after serious injuries, and once a fever began to rise, it often meant death was only a matter of time. Down with the sickness. Growing up in the Middle Ages was incredibly dangerous from the very beginning of life. Nearly 1 out of every 4 children died before reaching the age of 5, and the risks started the moment they were born. Childbirth itself was often life-threatening. Cesarean sections were usually performed only when the mother was already close to death, and if labor became difficult, midwives had little to depend on besides experience, prayer, and educated guesswork. Life expectancy was painfully short. Even if someone survived infancy and childhood, most peasants were fortunate to live beyond their mid-40s. Childhood illnesses that are usually manageable today, such as scarlet fever, measles, mumps, and whooping cough, were often deadly back then. Even something as ordinary as teething was feared as a possible cause of death. To treat it, people sometimes cut into a baby's gums, believing it would help. In reality, that practice often introduced dangerous infections, making an already risky stage of childhood even more hazardous. You have to remember that this was a world without antibiotics, vaccines, or any real understanding of germs. Even a tiny cut or scrape could quickly become infected and turn into a fatal injury. For many medieval families, having several children wasn't simply a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival. Parents knew there was a heartbreaking chance that not every child would live long enough to reach adulthood, so large families were often the only way to ensure that some children survived. Before anyone understood bacteria or viruses, people had no real explanation for why diseases spread. Looking back, it's not surprising that illness was so widespread, especially in crowded medieval towns and cities. People believed that foul-smelling air, known as bad air or miasma, was responsible for spreading disease. While their understanding was incorrect, the terrible conditions they lived in certainly didn't help. The streets often served as open sewers where waste collected in plain sight. Farm animals wandered freely through the roads, and personal hygiene was inconsistent at best and completely ignored at worst. Local officials did try to improve public health by introducing sanitation rules, but keeping cities clean was an overwhelming challenge. One royal order from the calendar of close rolls during the reign of Edward III in 1332 shows just how bad conditions had become in the English city of York. To the mayor and bailiffs of York, the king, detesting the abominable smell spreading throughout the city more than in any other city in the kingdom because of dung, manure, and other filth clogging the streets and lanes, and wishing to protect the health of both the inhabitants and those traveling to the present Parliament, orders that all streets and lanes be cleaned of such filth before the feast of St. Andrew, and that they be kept clean afterward. Today, it's easy to understand how filthy, overcrowded, and foul-smelling environments helped diseases spread. Illnesses like typhoid, tuberculosis, pneumonia, the sweating sickness, and, most famously, the plague, thrived under these conditions. Once someone became infected, their chances of recovering were often very slim. Medieval medicine was based largely on ideas inherited from the ancient Greeks. Physicians believed the human body was controlled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and they blamed illness on an imbalance between them. Their treatments often involved bloodletting, purging, and strange mixtures that were supposed to restore balance. To be fair, not every remedy was useless. Some herbal medicines and traditional treatments, developed through generations of practical experience, genuinely provided relief. Unfortunately, many other cures were more dangerous than the illnesses themselves. Toxic substances like mercury and arsenic were commonly prescribed as medicine, while cosmetics containing lead were widely used. Ironically, if you were wealthy enough to afford a physician, there was a very real possibility that the treatment you paid for would leave you in even worse condition than before. Even the smallest injury could become a death sentence. Wounds that seem insignificant today were often life-threatening because people had no antiseptics, no understanding of bacteria, no sterile bandages, and no tetanus vaccines. A simple fall from a cart or a small cut while harvesting grain could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene, sepsis, and, all too often, death. Appetite for destruction. Keeping enough food on the table during the Middle Ages was a constant struggle. The entire food supply was incredibly fragile, and a single failed harvest could push whole communities toward starvation. Whether crops were ruined by relentless storms, severe drought, or swarms of insects, one bad growing season was often all it took to create a food crisis. With very little food being imported and only limited stores of salted meat and grain, which were easily spoiled by rot or destroyed by rats, people lived with the constant fear of running out of something to eat. One of the worst disasters came during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which devastated much of northern Europe. Endless rainfall ruined the harvests, fields became unusable, huge numbers of livestock died, and grain reserves slowly disappeared. As food supplies collapsed, starvation spread across entire regions. Sadly, this wasn't the only time medieval people faced such unimaginable hardship. The Chronicle of the Scottish Nation, written by John of WOULDN, records that during the famine of 1310, many Scots became so desperate that they survived by eating the flesh of horses and other animals that were normally considered unclean. The suffering grew even worse in Ireland. According to historical accounts, by 1317, hunger had become so severe that people resorted to horrifying acts simply to stay alive. One chronicler wrote that desperate individuals dug up bodies from cemeteries, stripped flesh from the bones, and ate it. The account even claims that some mothers, driven beyond the limits of human endurance by starvation, consumed their own children. Meanwhile, conditions in Dublin became just as desperate. Food prices climbed so high that families who had once supported others were reduced to begging in the streets, and countless people died because they simply couldn't afford to eat. England faced its own nightmare as well. Some chroniclers claimed that starving people became so desperate they kidnapped children and killed them for food. Whether every report was completely accurate or not, these accounts reveal just how terrifying and desperate the famine had become. The English chronicler John Trocolo of St. Albans Abbey described another deadly consequence of the famine. He explained that starvation was made even worse by disease, writing that many people became sick after eating spoiled food. They suffered from severe intestinal illnesses, high fevers, and painful throat infections before eventually dying. Livestock experienced the same fate, collapsing and dying after consuming contaminated feed. Modern historians believe the illness John described was most likely ergotism, a poisoning caused by eating grain infected with ergot fungus. During the Middle Ages, this terrifying condition was known as St. Anthony's fire. Victims often experienced agonizing muscle spasms, vivid hallucinations, burning sensations throughout the body, and, in the worst cases, gangrene that caused fingers, toes, and entire limbs to rot away. For many people already weakened by hunger, the disease proved fatal. All that remains. During the Middle Ages, punishment was a part of everyday life, and even innocent people could find themselves caught in the machinery of medieval justice. The legal system was often brutally unfair, especially if you were poor or had no one powerful to defend you. Many early trials weren't based on evidence at all. Instead, people were forced to endure ordeals involving combat, fire, or water, with the outcome supposedly revealing God's judgment. One of the most infamous examples was the ordeal by water. A person accused of a crime could be tied up and thrown into a nearby pond or river. If they floated, it was taken as proof that they were guilty, and execution often followed. If they sank, they were declared innocent, but by then they had probably drowned. Either way, survival was far from guaranteed. Even relatively minor crimes could end with the person being hanged. Medieval punishments weren't just meant to punish the guilty, they were designed to frighten everyone else. Public humiliations like the stocks, branding, whipping, and executions were staged where large crowds could watch, serving as grim warnings about the consequences of breaking the law. Since there was no organized national police force, justice often depended on rumors, local feuds, and the influence of powerful neighbors. A bad reputation or a personal grudge could easily determine someone's fate. Accusations of heresy or witchcraft were among the most dangerous charges anyone could face. In a society where the Catholic Church held enormous power, heresy was considered a capital crime and was often punished by burning at the stake. Allegations of witchcraft frequently fell on older women, widows, or people known for using herbal remedies. You didn't need a spellbook or a bubbling cauldron to become a suspect. A failed harvest, a neighbor's dead livestock, or an old disagreement with someone seeking revenge could be enough to put your life in danger. The trials themselves offered very little hope for justice. Defending yourself was almost impossible, and confessions were often forced through torture. Once a confession had been extracted, conviction was almost certain, and those carrying out the sentence believed they were serving both justice and God. Fire was another constant danger in medieval life. With homes built from timber, roofs covered in dry thatch, and nearly every building lit by candles or heated with open fireplaces, entire towns were little more than waiting tinderboxes. During the hot summer months, a single unattended flame could spread with incredible speed. Since there were no professional fire brigades, one small accident could destroy an entire neighborhood before anyone had a chance to stop it. London experienced several devastating fires during the Middle Ages. One of the earliest recorded appears in the Book of Ancient Laws, written in 1274. It states, "In this year was the great fire of Southwark, and it burned the church of St. Mary Overy, the bridge with its chapel, and a great part of the city." Danger wasn't limited to crime or disaster. Everyday work could be just as deadly. There were no workplace safety regulations, and construction workers regularly fell from scaffolding while building the magnificent Gothic cathedrals that still stand today. Many people also drowned because swimming was an uncommon skill. A simple trip to the river to wash clothes, gather water, or catch fish could easily end in tragedy. In the Middle Ages, death was never far away. Disease, famine, accidents, violence, war, or simple bad luck could claim a life without warning. Every day carried risks that most people today never have to think about. By understanding how medieval people lived and how they died, we gain a much clearer picture of just how uncertain life once was. It reminds us how much the world has changed and how many of the dangers that were once unavoidable have gradually been overcome. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. If you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Your support and engagement genuinely help us keep making videos like this. We upload a brand new episode every Friday, so don't forget to turn on notifications so you'll know as soon as the next one goes live. If you're looking for even more content, we've also launched a Patreon where we post an extra video every month. There are already several exclusive videos available there if you'd like to check them out. And finally, a huge thank you to our higher tier patrons whose names are on the screen right now. Your support makes these videos possible, and we truly appreciate it. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Take care, and as always, I'll see you next week.